our 2014-15 series of distinguished lectures. I'm Professor Gavin Esler, I'm Vice-Chancellor, and it's a privilege, as well as a pleasure, to welcome Gavin Esler to the University. Gavin is an award-winning television and radio broadcaster, journalist, and author. He's a presenter on Dateline London, on BBC World, and BBC News Channel. He's presented numerous other TV and radio programmes, ranging from Newsnight to breakfast news. And I'm sure many of us have come to take Gavin for granted as a calm, authoritative figure on our screens. As is my usual practice, I went on to Wikipedia to find out more about Gavin, Wikipedia being a central research tool these days. This can be dangerous. Consulting Wikipedia once led me to ask DJ Spoonie about why he was such a big fan of the films of Ingmar Bergman. Suffice to say, he wasn't. However, I hope I'm right in reporting Gavin is a big fan of progressive rock. And being reacquainted with names such as Gong and Hawkwind certainly took me back to my youth. I saw both those bands at Liverpool Stadium in the 1970s. It took me back to my youth, I'm sure resonates with many others, especially men of a certain age, I suspect, in the audience. Gavin began his journalism career with the Belfast Telegraph and then moved on to the BBC, where he became chief North America correspondent between 1989 and 1997. He has reported from countries as diverse as China, Peru, Argentina, Cuba, Brazil, Russia, Jordan, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And he's interviewed most of the world leaders who've made the political weather over the last 30 years, such as Margaret Thatcher, David Cameron, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, King Abdullah Jordan, Jack Chirac, Chris Pakistan, Bill Clinton, Shimon Peres, and many, many more. Gavin is a frequent newspaper and magazine columnist with publications including The Scotsman, The Daily Mail, The Mail Sunday, The Mirror, The Independent, Navi, and The New Statesman. He's also the author of 5 novels and a non-fiction book about the United States called The United States of Anger. His most recent book, Lessons at the Top, the 3 stories that every leader tells, is based on his encounters with many current and past world leaders. He's the drafter at the Royal Society of Arts and the holder of a Royal Television Society Award for a documentary about the Aleutian Islands. In 2007, he was also awarded a Sony Gold Award for a radio documentary on a prisoner held without trial in Guantanamo Bay, Sami al-Hajj. And after the broadcast, Mr. al-Hajj was released. Gavin became Chancellor of the University of Kent in January 2014, of which he is also an alumnus. Gavin, I'd like to invite you to present your student lecture, A Power of Stories.
Thank you very much. I should say at the start about Wikipedia. My wife's entry of Wikipedia says that she paid her way through the London School of Economics partly by appearing as a stunt double in the James Bond film Die Another Day. She didn't. Sadly. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry Jeremy Clarkson couldn't be here. But undoubtedly he will have plenty more time in order to take up invitations in the future. I'm very pleased to be in this great city and also in this great institution. And I am here to talk about the power of stories. How leaders tell stories to build trust and what we can learn from how they do it and why they do it. And it is based largely on leaders that I met. The most recent book, Lessons from the Top, includes interviews with Angela Merkel and Bill Clinton and 1 or 2 others, which we might talk about in a moment. I'm not saying that telling stories is what leadership is all about. There's plenty of different criteria on which we judge our leaders. Decisiveness, creativity, and so on. But I am saying that if you don't have any followers, you're not a leader, because nobody's following you. And the way you connect with followers, largely, is to tell stories, and that has been true throughout human history. One of the reasons that leaders do it is to build trust. And let me take a step back for a moment, because I hope my next book is going to be about trust or the lack of it. in the 21st century. We have a problem with trust. We have a problem with virtually every institution that you could name has lost trust, as far as we can tell, over the past 30 years. I've looked at, for instance, the 81 trust barometer that measured trust around the world since 2001, Ipsos Mori, YouGov, British Social Attitude Survey in this country. And they all show that the 21st century is a rather suspicious century. If you just think about the news, you'll know that trust in almost any institution, Roman Catholic Church, banks, financial institutions, big business too, and also the media, although the media is a fairly mixed bag. There's good news and bad news about trust in the media. The bad news is that over the past decade or so, newspapers like the Times and Guardian have lost about 30%, as far as one can measure it, is what people say, of the trust of people in this country. The BBC has lost about 20% of the trust of people in this country. The good news, however, is that tabloid newspapers have not lost any trust. Because nobody ever trusted them. So at least they're consistent. Politicians, and there may be some politicians present, you will know, have never been entirely trusted, but the climate of suspicion is such that some polls say fewer than 10% of British people trust our political leaders to do the right thing all or most of the time. And in fact, in America, anybody under the age of 40 has never lived in a country where the majority of people trust political leaders of any party to do the right thing all or most of the time. And it's no coincidence, it seems to me, that in the past 15 years, we have seen the resignation of the first Pope in 600 years, the resignation of the first Speaker of the House of Commons in 300 years, the impeachment of an American president for the first time since the 19th century, and the resignations of 2 Directors General of the BBC, plus the obvious observation that CEOs of big corporations are likely to last about as long as a Premiership football manager. They don't last very long. But we all know that trust is a great resource. If you are trusted, you don't have to tick all those compliance boxes, you don't have to fear the question of litigation, you don't have to have the Financial Services Authority or any of the structures that we create to verify what we're doing and check what we're doing. You don't have to have those reading every day. It seems to me that there are various pillars of trust. One is integrity, one is benevolence, and the third is competence. Those seem to me to be the 3 main pillars of trust that we all look for in individuals that we know and institutions. But as a trusted leader, you have to be able to communicate that you are trustworthy. And you do that by doing your job, but you also do that, in history people have done it, by telling stories. And there's nothing new in this. This is always like Christian. Jesus did it in parables. Moses did it as well. Moses did not say, guys, I've been having a think, I've been having a walk in the desert, and I've come up with 10 great rules to live by. He told a magnificent story. I've been on the mountaintop, I met God himself, and he's given me these 10 commandments. It's a story. It's a great story, and that's why it's lasted. The kickoff point for my research was not quite Moses, it was actually Alistair Campbell. A few years I interviewed him last week actually about the Literary Festival. He's written a book on winners, which is very interesting. But a few years ago I had to introduce him at a big conference, and it would be fair to say he was not at that point the most trusted person in the world. And it would have been a fairly hostile audience. And he said to me before I did the introduction, what are you going to say about me? And I said, I'm going to say you're Alistair Campbell, you're Tony Blair's former Director of Communications. He said, that's great, that's fine. Short factor. He got up on the stage and he said, he liked my introduction. It was a lot better than the one the previous week when he'd been in Leeds and had been introduced as, please will you welcome Alistair Campbell, the most evil man in Britain. And I thought, why did he do that? Why did he say that? Why did he tell that particular story about himself? He told a self-deprecating story about trust, but he told it in a particular way in which he was making fun of himself and connecting with the audience. And by the end, actually, of this talk, which was an interesting talk, the audience was started out fairly hostile, ended up in a slightly different frame of mind. We're all actually storytellers. I'm in a room full of storytellers. You tell a story to come to university. You tell a personal statement. You write a personal statement. If you've got a job, you tell a story to get a job. You call it a CV. You tell a story to get a mortgage. You tell a story to get a business loan. You don't just walk in and say, I need the money, here's my documents. People want to know who you are, what you need the money for, what you're going to do. You tell stories about your organisation or company. You tell stories about this university. Leaders tell stories, but they just do it in a more organised fashion. And after that discussion with Alison Campbell, during the 2010 election campaign, general election campaign, I spent a lot of time interviewing the top political leaders on various TV programs. And one of them was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling. And of course I wanted to know what the government's plans were for the British economy, what he was likely to do, and so on. After doing the interview with him one night, I went home and switched on another TV channel. And Alistair Darling was being interviewed by Piers Morgan. Piers Morgan, during the greatest economic crisis of my lifetime, said to him, so tell me, Chancellor, are you good in bed? Which was the point I realised why my career never really taken off. I actually never thought of actually asking that question. It was a very strange election campaign. Around that same time, you may remember, Nick Clegg was asked how many lovers he had. He settled in around 30. David Cameron was asked how he conceived his child, and Samantha Cameron was pregnant. I don't think he answered the question, but I suspect it was probably in the usual way. And I thought, the kind of stories that we're expecting from our leaders, he is expecting from our leaders, and presumably they think there's a market for this. People think there's a market for it. It certainly wasn't Piers Morgan. People watch this program. Something had changed in storytelling. I wanted to get to the bottom of that as well. I mean, can you imagine Winston Churchill being asked any of those questions? Are you good in bed? Oh, yes, I drink two bottles of claret and half a bottle of brandy and I sleep all night. Mrs. Thatcher being asked that question. You know, it just loops. So I then started to think back on all the leaders that I've met and how they did it. How did they communicate? Were there any common factors? They're all very different people with very different skills, but they're all in different ways good communicators within their cultures and their personalities. All of them told three basic stories. Who am I as a person? Who are we as a group? And where is my leadership going to take us? Or what's our common purpose? Who am I? Who are we? And where are we going? They all did. And I realized that if you don't completely buy into the who am I story, you're not really going to be listening to the who are we story. And you're certainly not going to know where the leadership is going to take us because you're not listening and you're not following. The who am I stories, I call them leadership stories. Just to give you a couple of examples. One of my favorites is Mrs. Thatcher's. Mrs. Thatcher constantly said, well, I'm the grocer's daughter from Grantham. 5 words, a story. I'm a grocer's daughter. I'm not that posh. I'm a daughter. I'm not a son. And I'm from Grantham. I'm not part of the metropolitan. Brilliant story. You can tell lots of other stories about Mrs. Thatcher, but that was a story she chose to tell about herself. And it was one that was amplified by the PR people where you probably remember famous picture of her wearing Fairy Marigolds doing the washing up. Now, you didn't see Harold Macmillan in Fairy Marigolds doing the washing up. This is a very different story. It's a very smart story. Bill Clinton. First time I met him, I literally bumped into him. It was in a hotel lobby in New Hampshire. He was governor of Arkansas. He wasn't yet running for the presidency of the United States, but he had been out running. It was about 7 in the morning. And I was dressed like this because I was going off to do some filming. And he came into the lobby, very hot, very sweaty, wearing very tight blue lycra running shorts. It was quite an unforgettable sight. I'll leave that one to your imagination. Now, he described himself, we had a really interesting conversation. He's a very interesting person. And Douglas Hurd once said to me, he gives you the impression of having just jogged all the way up from Arkansas, just the delight of making your acquaintance. And he did have that light up a room kind of characteristic, even at 7 in the morning. And during the course of our conversation, he said, well, you've got to realize my political philosophy comes from the fact that I am just the boy from home. Hope, Arkansas being the town that he originally came from. And he told that story repeatedly. He had to tell one or two other stories because he wanted to very significant things. So we can get up to that. But the boy from Hope story was very interesting because when I went to Hope, Arkansas, lovely little town, people of course remembered it and they were very proud of him. But they also mentioned he did most of his growing up in a place called Hot Springs, which is a gambling town. Somehow failed to mention that. When it comes to the Who Am I stories, it's not just what people say, it's how they look. Mrs. Thatcher, you may know, was advised, get rid of the hats, don't wear so many perils, to dress in a particular way. Nelson Mandela is a very, very good example of somebody who told the story by the way he dressed. When he was first arraigned before an apartheid court, he wore traditional corset dress. So he didn't have to say a word as he walked into the court. Here was a very educated, smart black man in a white man's court. It was unfair. And he didn't have to say a word, and everybody around the world got it. Many years later, if there's any rugby fans present, you may remember in the 1990s when the Rugby World Cup went to South Africa, the former prisoner Mandela, now President Mandela, was trying to tell a very different story about new South Africa, and he turned up at the Rugby World Cup wearing a Springbok shirt. That was a really clear story. This was, in neither case, I should say, this was not the Springbok shirt was the only clean shirt you had to wear that one. It was a very deliberate storytelling moment where he was saying white people, black people, people of different colours, different races, different ethnic backgrounds, we are the Rainbow Nation. It was, in my view, a story. The who are we stories? Well, you know, who are we? Who are we at this university? The university will tell a story, or in business, or so on. When I try to think about how to illustrate this, it seems to me the most obvious way is to talk about our political parties as we approach this next general election. Labour was old Labour, New Labour, took that from Bill Clinton and the New Democrats. Rebranded the Who Are We story in the United States, something Tony Blair did here too. Ed Miliband, you may remember, said we're not all Labour, we're not New Labour, we're One Nation Labour. Although they haven't really banged on about that, but one of the storytelling techniques I would suggest is if you really believe in a story, you have to repeat it. And he hasn't done that. The Conservatives, you may remember, there was one point where they talked about being compassionate conservatives. This was around the big society kind of idea. And like many of these ideas, it was nicked from the other side of the Atlantic. In this case, from George W. Bush. In 2000, in Philadelphia, at the Republican convention, I was lucky enough to be there, standing in the audience. And it was the first time in George W. when he was accepting the nomination of his party to run for the presidency. He had been told by Karen Higgins, one of his very smart advisors, that he was now compassionate conservative. And he rolled out that phrase at in front of the audience. And I was really puzzled by it. So I never, what was that? I didn't know what it meant. So I got a friend who was standing next to me, who was an all-time Republican, and I said, what does compassionate conservative mean? And he said, anything we were in the past that you don't like, we're not that anymore. And anything that we were in the past that you still like, we're still that. So who are we? So who am I? Who are we? Where my leadership is going to take us, well, it depends on the situation. I'm much less interested in that. That's not so much about the storytelling technique. That demands different types of leadership. Well, I am fascinated by how some of the other storytellers that I've met tell stories which, again, I think we can use and also see through, and also inform our politics. One of the lessons I've discovered is that politicians should confront the worst that other people think about them. It's a very important lesson because we all have what I call a pre-story. We all have a kind of prejudice. If Bill Clinton walked in here, Ed Miliband walked in here, David Cameron walked in here, Nick Clegg, you would have a pre-story in your head of what that person was like. They don't just sort of appear from Mars. We think we know them in a way. They need to confront that because some of that would be negative. That's what Alistair Campbell did when he said that he called them this evil man. One of the most brilliant storytellers I've ever met, who was absolutely excellent at doing this, is a business leader, I suppose you can say. Her name is Dolly Parton. We're obviously aware of one of her businesses, it's the entertainment business. She also runs a thing called Dollywood, which is a theme park in East Tennessee, which employs, I think, about 4,000 people. She runs a charity which makes sure that kids and I interviewed her, I spent a day with her in Nashville a couple of years ago, and what really struck me was how she constantly confronted the worst about other people. So, for example, we got on very well, I should say, and I said at one point, do the dumb blonde jokes get into your nerves? And she said, no, because I know I'm not really dumb, and I know I'm not really blonde. She's also famously said, it takes me a while to lie to with this cheap. Another one who does the same thing, and this is a transferable skill, I promise you, because whatever your profession or your business, whatever you do, people will have an impression of you, which you may feel that you need to correct. And the only way you can correct it is by confronting it. Anthony Jolie, a few years ago, I was given the onerous task of having to go to Europe. And I confess I wasn't keen on that here, which made me rather wrong. I can't tell you exactly what he said, and there was expletives were in it. But I couldn't understand what the point of the interview was, and I thought she would be a Hollywood airhead, and she clearly thought I would think that she was a Hollywood airhead. So when we met, she was at great pains to say, when she was filming Tomb Raider, she could have just spent her time in Hollywood in the shopping malls and making movies, but she saw some kids in Cambodia with no limbs, their legs blown off. And she asked somebody what the cause of that was, and it was called Pol Pot. And she said, I said, what's a Pol Pot? She never heard of the Cambodian thing. But she learned. And she learned very quickly, and she became an advocate against landmines, and she now is the US Special Representative, and she does remarkably great work in war zones against the war. But confronted immediately what she thought I would think of her. And by sort of genius, it was exactly what I thought. Another technique that some of the writers use is a kind of violation, similar to this, but it's a violation of expectations. You have these expectations of people. So, in the case of Alistair Campbell, you don't expect anyone to say, I'm the most evil man. Other people do it as well. Steve Jobs and Apple just launched their watch. What was interesting was to watch how they did it, because they didn't have Steve Jobs, but they had a guy who dressed just like Steve Jobs. If Steve Jobs came in here to sell you the Apple Watch, you know he would be dressed like this, he'd be wearing pretty scuzzy blue jeans, some dirty trainers, an open neck shirt, and he'd go, look, I'm not corporate. I'm just a bit. And look at this is amazing. By the way, I run one of the world's biggest corporations. It was a storytelling technique, and it worked for him, and it was natural to him. It wasn't as if he wanted a lot of people to tell him that's what he had to do. But it was a very, very successful technique. Michael O'Leary, the Ryanair, actually, did something very similar. Sometimes he would do television interviews wearing a rugby shirt. And this must be the only conversation you will ever hear in which Michael O'Leary and Nelson Mandela have something in common. Michelle Bachelet, who is president of Chile, she had one term as president and then way to do it, to work for me and understand that. But before all that, she was the defense minister. And before all that, she was the daughter of someone who had been murdered by the military in Chile. Her father was a doctor, a left-wing doctor, a socialist during the 1970s, after the coup against Allende. And I got to talk to Michelle actually a few years ago. And I was really interested by this. I mean, we were doing a for other meetings, but I was very interested in how a woman who had a natural country, which had not been an officer, could be the defense minister of the church. I think she could. And she said to me, I need to do that because I thought it was a wonderful thing. She said, all these admirals and air force generals and army together. And I said to them, I'm a woman, a socialist, I'm divorced, and agnostic. All the sins together, but I'm sure we'll get on very well. She's a genius. And of course, they did get on very well. Chile is a stable democracy, and she did do that. So, one of the great techniques of real storytelling that we all got since to me is to be honest about your own faults and think about how other people see and to address them. And another way in which they do it is what I call a star moment, something they always remember. The first star moment that happened to me was way back when I started as a journalist, which was in Belfast. And I was trying to meet the leader of a terrorist organisation who had a lot of blood in its hands. And I was slightly worried about this meeting. I was very worried. And I showed it to a busy, rather dusty and dirty hall in East Belfast. And I was sat in the corner and was told that this person would turn up short. So about 10 minutes later, when I had plenty of time to reflect on the meaning of life, this gentleman came in, and memory is a funny thing. I remember it as the floorboards bouncing, because he was big and muscle. And when he came over to me, instead of saying, hello, Belfast's a very friendly place, I expected a bit of conversation. His first words to me were, I'm speaking to you as someone deeply involved in violence. Well, clearly come to the right place. And that was something they always remember. That was a star moment. Again, he didn't do it because somebody told him to do it. He did it because that's the kind of person he was. Bill Gates, who's not usually credited as being the world's greatest communicator, did something similar when he was trying to raise money for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which, as I'm sure you know, it does a lot of very good work against malaria and AIDS and tuberculosis in Africa. And with a group of business people, he came into a room like this, delivered a bit of a lecture, and he had this big jar. And as he's coming to the end of the lecture, he holds up the jar, and it's quite obvious to people that there are mosquitoes in the jar. And as he's coming to the punchline, he starts to unscrew the top of the jar. And he says, and so I don't think it should only be poor people who have the opportunity to get malaria. They gave him a lot of money. Now, of course, I should say, they were not malaria mosquitoes. But it was a very clever star. It was a brilliant way of communicating with people and reaching an audience through a kind of story. There's also, obviously, in the book I did a chapter called What Not to Do, which features rather greatly Tony Hayward of BP after the Gulf War spill, and also Gordon Brown makes a showing in that chapter. One of the things that always struck me about Gordon Brown was, I grew up in Edinburgh, and I knew something about his story going way back. And he was blind in one eye. He was blind in one eye. He was a rugby accent. And he didn't make anything of it. Now, I'm not saying that he should have done. Maybe that's a really difficult thing he did. He didn't make something of, perhaps he felt it was weakness. I don't know what was going on in his head. But had he said during television debates, for example, look, I know a little bit grumpy and weird on television. That's because I can't see him at all. I can only see him a bit. I'm sorry about that, but if you want John F. Kennedy, you'll have to go with somebody else. He never addressed it. And all I would suggest to you is that if Tony Blair had been blind in one eye from a rugby accident, he would never have heard the end of it. Some of the words that leaders use are very interesting too. During the next election campaign, I suggest to you that you look out for some words that Newt Gingrich very cleverly. Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States. He ran for the presidency as a Republican. And he told his Republican fellows, when they were coming up for re-election, that there was a group of words they had to say about themselves in telling stories, and a group of words they had to use about the Democrats. The words that he called optimistic governing words, which were the ones that he wanted his side to use, are candid, care, challenge, children, courage, debate, dream, environment, family, hard work, legacy, liberty, etc. Bad guys: bureaucracy, cheat, collapse, corrupt, cynicism, decay, destroy, destructive, failure. Does anything strike a chord with you? If it doesn't strike a chord with you now, I promise you, by the beginning of May, you will remember this bit, if nothing else. One of my pretensions is that's one of the things that sucks so much of the air out of our politics in American politics and elsewhere in translation. Because those words are, well, they're value loaded, but they don't particularly refer to anything. They're just a sort of hit that you can use to refer to yourself as I'm great, I'm candid, and I believe in family and hard work. You, sir, I'm afraid you are bureaucracy, cheat, collapse, corrupt. See, you did so already. I want to put you on your vision in the front row. Those words are used by all our politicians, sadly, and I think it's rather unfortunate. This is not, in our much more suspicious age, a way to build trust, because we all see through it, and we see through much more than we see. So, I'm very happy to take questions in this, but I just want to end with some takeaway thoughts and thoughts about universities, and also maybe about the stories, so you can see how people that you perhaps don't entirely think of as great storytellers, how they did. One of my favourites is to talk about Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan does not translate this. He was elected twice in the United States. Landslide. Over here, if you read any of our newspapers, from the right or the left, he was a sort of idiotic actor. Didn't know him. I got elected. That is the story that was told on this side of the Atlantic. I've got a friend who was a very young journalist from Beirut, and at the tail end of the Reagan presidency, when Reagan was running out of steam, and developed signs of early onset of Alzheimer's, but he wasn't very well with his shot, as usual. My friend was due to go back to New York, and because he had some kind of interesting insights into what was going on the left, the White House said to me, drop in, have a word with the National Security Advisor and some of the National Security staff, which is what my friend did. Ronald Reagan dropped in. Now, my friend was not a Republican, wouldn't have voted for Reagan, didn't particularly like his policies. But that's the third bit. That's the word my leadership in him. You never met both. He was very funny. And Reagan said to him, so what's that for you, son? And he said, well, Mr. President, after this meeting, I'm going to go to a hotel here in Washington, have a shower, I'm going to shave my beard off, and then I'm going to fly to New York City and see my editor-in-chief, and then I'm going to go back and do my job in the news. Oh, why do you have to shave your beard off? He said, because it's more than my job's worth. My editor-in-chief doesn't think you into a professional. So that's why So that's Reagan. That's my friend. 2 weeks later, he got a phone call from his editor-in-chief. What the hell have you been saying to Ronald Reagan? And my friend said, well, how do you mean? And he said, well, I was at the American Society of Newspaper Editors breakfast with the president's name. And I was berating him for his ultra-conservative, illiberal policies. And he said to me, I may be ultra-conservative and illiberal, but I let a guy wear a beard. Now, my friend, still not Republican, still wouldn't vote for Republican. He loved Ronald Reagan. There was a connection with that story. And many people that I know who worked with Reagan in the White House. Here's a secret about all media operations. With famous figures like Reagan, you do the obituaries while it's still alive. So I did the Reagan obituary, and I got to know Michael Beaver, who's a very interesting guy. I forget his title, is something like Deputy Chief of Staff in the Reagan White House. But he was the man responsible for making Reagan look good. And he said it's kind of easy. You look presidential. He was an actor. He worked very surprisingly to many people on this side of the Atlantic. He worked very hard for the speeches, particularly in the early years. He sometimes did 10 speeches a day. And he made it so he was speaking to you and you and you. Individually crafted. That's the way it sounded, and as if he just made that. Anyway, Beaver told me this story about, he said, you've got to realize that when it comes to connecting with people, it starts with those closest to you. It starts with your inner circle, because they see the difference between the stories you tell and how you really are. And in the case of George W. Bush, just to skip a little bit, a friend of mine who worked for him said, "All you British is if you think George W. Bush is nice but dumb." Neither part of that sentence is true. But with Reagan, he was telling this great story. He said, as you know, after he was shot, he didn't work in the bar. He would turn up at the Oval Office at 9 o'clock in the morning. He might have a little nap, and he would go back to the living quarters in the White House about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. One morning he turned up at 9 o'clock, as usual, with his dog. And it had been a night when the key White House staff was up all night from a foreign policy crisis. Also, I don't know. They were all male. They were all robustly macho. They had hooked neck shirts, and they had done a lot of activity during the night. They were tired and grumpy. Reagan breezes in, and the dog runs round and round and round in the Oval Office. According to Beaver, one of those presidents slapped the desk and said, "Mr. President, one day that dog is going to piss on your desk." Reagan said, "Everybody else does." He had the trust of his staff. He didn't carry to the side of the Atlantic, but he had a kind of, I suppose you would say, storytelling contact with the American people. He got elected twice, because in a way, it was above politics. He seemed to run against the government of which he was the leader. He was very clever if you're a politician. He also said, quite memorably, when asked a very detailed question about a scandal that affected the White House, and I think how politicians handle scandals is very interesting, because scandals, of course, are very trust. It was the Iran Contra scandal, for those of you who remember, it was very complicated. And Reagan was asked, how could it possibly be that the Defense Department and the National Security Advisor and the CIA were all at loggerheads, and it was a complete mess. And Reagan said, I guess the right hand just didn't know what the far right hand was doing. And when you think of it, that's pure Dolly Parton. That's exactly the same technique that she used. And I can't actually remember what the question was, but I do remember his response. It shows why storytelling works. My final thoughts are, I'm very proud to be the Chancellor of the University of Kent, and I'm proud of our universities in general. One of the reasons I'm proud is that scientists, academics, teachers are among our most trusted professions. But when I did research for the next book, one of the things that interested me was Financial Times looked at salaries in the 1970s of various broadly middle-class professions. And those of you who are employed by university, it is interested to know that university professors in the 1970s would take a little more than the average pay in the financial services sector. I don't think this is true now. If anybody would like to correct me, I'm happy to be corrected. One of the strange things that's happened over the last 40 years is that professions that we trust have tended to be rewarded less well than professions like bankers, in particular, but professions that we trust are paying relatively less well than professions that we don't. And I think that's very interesting. I therefore think that it's a good time for universities to start thinking about how we can tell a better story about ourselves. What is our function? What is the public good? Where do we show competence, integrity, and benevolence? What is it we need that other people do? It's a story, I think, which is very important for our culture, for our economy, and the future prosperity of our country. I think universities are trusted because we value knowledge for its own sake. It's fine if we can sell. It's great if we have students that get jobs. That's part of what we do. But we also don't put a price on things that are beyond price. I have no idea how much the Higgs boson discovery is worth. Not a clue. Perhaps nothing. Or Shakespeare's sonnet. But they are beyond value in mind. That's part of the story of who I am, that's how I think, and I think that's how most people in universities think. Universities have got a great story to tell, so those of you who are connected with this university, I would urge you to think how best to tell that who are we story. And finally, if you haven't really bought into the basic premise of this, that story time is really good, let me remind you of two great storytellers. One was Julius Caesar, who wrote about himself in the third person in the Gallic Wars. So Julius Caesar, the writer, wrote about Julius Caesar, the general. We thought he was a very fun chap. More recently, Winston Churchill once said, "History shall be kind to me, for I will write."